There comes a moment in every overachiever's life when the applause stops meaning anything, not burnout, not laziness, something quieter than that, something that looks, from the outside, like giving up, but is actually the opposite. Dr. Elena Voss spent over 20 years studying people who had built their entire identity around performing excellence. She wasn't looking for exhaustion. She was looking for the ceiling, the point where achievement stops producing relief. What she found didn't look like depression, and it didn't look like quitting. She called it the final stage of achievement identity, and she said, it terrifies everyone who depended on the achiever, because when a high achiever finally stops trying to prove themselves, they don't become lazy, they become unreachable, and that changes everything around them. Before we understand why the achiever stops performing, we need to understand what built the performance in the first place. Voss documented a consistent pattern across her most driven patients. These weren't people who occasionally worked hard towards something they wanted. These were individuals whose entire sense of self had been assembled, piece by piece, out of what they produced. Take away the achievement, and there was no clear answer to the question, who am I without it? It usually started early. The child who got attention for grades, not for simply existing. The one who noticed without anyone saying it directly that love in their house came with conditions attached. That affection spiked when a report card came home and cooled when it didn't. They learned the lesson fast, the way children learn any lesson that determines whether they're safe. Perform and you are seen. Rest and you disappear. By adolescence, this had calcified into identity. They were the responsible one, the smart one, the one who never causes problems. Other kids got room to struggle. They got room to deliver. Every accolade reinforced the arrangement. Every silence when they slipped reinforced it further. They learned to read a room for what performance was required of them, and they learned to supply it before anyone had to ask. Into adulthood, this pattern didn't loosen, it professionalized. They became the employee who stayed 45 minutes after everyone left, not because the work demanded it, but because leaving on time felt like admitting they weren't essential. They became the friend who organized every gathering, remembered every birthday, showed up first and left last, and never once said, I need something too. They became the family member who could be counted on for anything, money, advice, a ride at 2 a.m. Because being needed was the closest thing to being loved that they'd ever learned to trust. And here is what made Voss's research so unsettling. These people almost never complained. They didn't experience their exhaustion as exploitation. They experienced it as proof. Proof they were capable. Proof they were reliable. Proof that, unlike other people, they could be counted on. Their fatigue wasn't a red flag to them. It was a badge, quietly worn, evidence that they were the kind of person who didn't cut corners, who didn't disappoint, who didn't need anyone to slow down for them. The cultural reinforcement ran deep and came from every direction. Teachers held them up as examples to the class. Parents introduced them by their accomplishments before their names. Managers gave them the hardest accounts because they never said no, and then were praised in performance reviews for exceptional ownership. Language that dressed up overextension as virtue. Every time they overrode their own limits to deliver one more thing, they received validation. Every time they said yes when their body was screaming for a no, someone told them how impressive their work ethic was. This positive reinforcement built a structure that felt, from the inside, like integrity. It was actually a slow erosion of the boundary between who they were and what they produced. But Voss noticed something the achievers themselves could not yet see. Behind the composed, high-functioning exterior, their nervous system was keeping a ledger. Every deadline that replaced a birthday dinner, every promotion that arrived the same month, a relationship quietly ended because there had been no time left for it. Every time someone said, I don't know what we'd do without you, instead of, How are you, really? Their unconscious mind wasn't cataloging these moments randomly. It was tracking them with precision, the way a body tracks every small debt before eventually calling it due. Consider someone who spent 15 years as the highest performer on every team they joined. They knew exactly which extra task to volunteer for to stay indispensable. They understood precisely how long they could go without acknowledgement before the ache set in, and they'd learned to override that ache automatically, without thinking, the way you learn to ignore a small chronic pain until it isn't small anymore. They could sense, almost immediately, when a room valued output over presence, and they adjusted instantly, because adjusting was the only language of belonging they'd ever been fully fluent in. What Voss found most remarkable was that despite this awareness, they never stopped, they never quietly negotiated for less. They just kept delivering, kept optimizing, kept absorbing more responsibility, until something inside them began, slowly, and then all at once, to crack. The breaking point almost never came from failure. Failure? Ironically, they knew how to survive. It fit the narrative. It was something to fix, to learn from, to convert into the next milestone. What broke them was a hollow win. The story repeats itself with striking consistency. Someone finally gets the promotion they'd been chasing for a decade, walks into the bigger office, and feels nothing where they expected relief. Someone makes partner at the firm, hosts the celebration dinner, smiles for the photos, and drives home to an apartment where no one is waiting to hear how it went, because there had never been time to build that kind of life. Someone hits every number on a scorecard they didn't even remember agreeing to chase, and understands, in one disorienting moment, that they had spent years auditioning for approval from people who were never actually watching that closely. What made these hollow wins so destructive wasn't the emptiness in the moment. It was the sudden, undeniable recognition that they had felt this coming for a long time and had kept running anyway. Some quiet internal voice had been saying, for months or years, this isn't actually working. This isn't actually filling anything. And they had overridden it, the same way they'd overridden every other inconvenient signal from their own body and instincts, because stopping to listen felt like falling behind. This realization didn't shatter their ambition. It shattered something more foundational. The belief that enough achievement would eventually, finally, produce the feeling of being enough. That belief had structured every major decision of their adult life. Watching it collapse was not dramatic. There was no breakdown, no public unraveling. If this is resonating with you right now, like this video and drop a comment. I see it now. Voss described this moment as one of the most striking transformations she witnessed in her clinical work. The achiever didn't cry or rage the way everyone around them expected. They didn't quit in a blaze of defiance or deliver a speech about burnout. Instead, something quieter, and, to the people around them, more unsettling happened. They simply got calm, unnervingly, uncharacteristically calm, and they stopped performing. They stopped over-explaining decisions they used to justify 3 different ways to preempt any criticism. They stopped taking on the project nobody else wanted, the one they used to volunteer for within seconds just to prove, again, that they could carry it. They stopped answering messages at 11 p.m. to appear endlessly available. They didn't announce any of this. They didn't send a manifesto. They simply stopped participating in the invisible economy of constant proof that had run their life for as long as they could remember. Managers who had quietly relied on them to carry the workload of 2 or 3 people suddenly discovered someone who did their actual job, did it well, and stopped there. Colleagues who had learned to route their own unfinished work in the achiever's direction, using guilt as the delivery mechanism, found that the guilt no longer landed. The office dynamic shifted, not because the achiever announced a change, but because the invisible labor that had been quietly propping up the system was gone. At home, the shift went even deeper. The one who had always organized the holidays smoothed over the family arguments, and remembered every obligation everyone else forgot, simply stopped filling those roles, not with a confrontation. They just became unavailable for the functions they had been unconsciously assigned since childhood. Parents who had leaned on their achievements to feel proud in front of relatives found a person who talked about their life in plain, unimpressive terms and didn't apologize for it. Siblings who had used comparison to the achiever as a private motivator suddenly had no scoreboard to point to. The family often responded with confusion, sometimes with accusation. Why aren't you trying anymore? What happened to you? You used to care so much about doing well. And the achiever would simply nod, because yes, something had changed. They had finally stopped setting themselves on fire to keep the family's sense of pride burning. In friendships, the same pattern surfaced. The friend who had always organized everyone's plans remembered every important date and shown up early to help set up and stayed late to help clean, simply stopped doing all of it by default. They still showed up, but as a participant, not as unpaid staff. Friendships that had quietly run on their labor for years revealed themselves in that absence as one-sided. Some friends adjusted and started reciprocating for the first time. Others drifted, uncomfortable with a version of the achiever who no longer overfunctioned to keep the friendship afloat, and went looking for someone new to fill that role. Romantic relationships showed the most dramatic shift of all. Partners who had relied on the achiever's constant competence, the one who remembered every bill, fixed every problem, and carried the emotional and logistical weight of the household without complaint, suddenly faced someone who expected to be met halfway. Some partners rose to the occasion, recognizing, often for the first time, how much they had been quietly taking for granted, and chose to become an equal partner rather than a dependent. These relationships often became something stronger, something built on reciprocity, instead of one person's endless capacity. Other partners could not adapt. They missed the version of the achiever, who absorbed every responsibility and asked for nothing back. When old tactics, subtle guilt, minor crises, appeals to how things used to be, stopped working, some left, quietly searching for someone else who would carry what they no longer had to. And the achiever, for the first time, let them go without the usual grief. Not because they didn't care, but because they finally understood something Voss had tried for years to teach her patience. You cannot build a stable sense of worth on a scoreboard controlled by someone else's expectations. This wasn't apathy. Apathy would have been familiar. Something people around them could work with, wait out, or eventually guilt back into its old shape. What they were witnessing instead was indifference to the entire scoreboard itself. People tried everything to provoke the old response, implying disappointment, hinting the achiever had lost their edge, dangling one more opportunity framed as unmissable. Nothing landed. The achiever watched these attempts with the detached curiosity of someone finally standing outside a game they had spent their whole life believing was the entire world. Voss called this the integration of enoughness. Every achiever, she argued, carries a suppressed belief they were taught early to override, that they were allowed to be enough before the achievement, not because of it. Culture had told them ambition was the only legitimate form of self-respect. Institutions had rewarded the hustle without ever asking what it cost. Families had built pride around output. But this quiet, suppressed belief in inherent worth wasn't weakness, Voss insisted. It had been the part of them trying to protect their life the entire time, buried under decades of performance. When the achiever finally let that belief back in, they didn't become complacent, and they didn't stop building things. The drive didn't vanish. It fused with a sense of worth that no longer needed external proof to feel real. What emerged was someone who still worked hard, but only on things that meant something to them personally. Someone who could walk away from prestige without flinching, because prestige had stopped being the thing holding their identity together. someone who chased mastery and meaning instead of applause. This is what Voss meant by achievement death. Not the death of ambition, but the death of ambition as a hostage negotiation with your own sense of self-worth. The most profound shift often happened quietly, in the smallest details of daily life. Their calendar, once packed to the edges with obligations that proved their importance, had open space in it. And for the first time, that space didn't feel like failure. Their inbox, once treated like a fire that had to be extinguished within the hour, could sit for a day without triggering panic. Their sense of self, once entirely outsourced to whatever they had most recently accomplished, started to include things achievement had never touched: rest, curiosity, ordinary, unremarkable afternoons. Voss's research revealed something both beautiful and unsettling about people who reached this stage. They became far harder to exploit through guilt or flattery, because both required the achiever to still be chasing external validation, and they no longer were. They could spot, almost instantly, when someone was trying to motivate them through comparison or manufactured urgency, tactics that used to work flawlessly. They simply didn't engage. Their new baseline functioned like an early warning system, protecting them without effort. But they didn't use this clarity to punish anyone who had exploited their old pattern. They didn't seek payback against the managers who had overloaded them, or the family members who had measured their worth in accomplishments. They simply stopped offering themselves up to be measured that way and moved forward. This restraint didn't come from passivity. It came from genuine disinterest in a game they had finally stepped outside of. Their presence started to change the atmosphere around them too. People chasing status through them, hoping to borrow some of their reputation or offload work onto their reliability, sensed almost immediately that the old dynamic no longer worked and moved on to easier targets. Meanwhile, people who valued them as whole human beings, not as a function, not as a resource, felt often for the first time like they could actually get close. This is where Voss's work landed on its central conclusion. The overachiever who stops trying to prove themselves hasn't lost their drive. They've relocated it. They haven't become indifferent to excellence. They've become indifferent to excellence as a substitute for being loved unconditionally. They haven't stopped working hard. They've stopped confusing hard work with self-worth. This evolution, Voss argued, represents the most advanced stage of achievement psychology she ever documented. Not because there's nowhere left to grow, but because the achiever has finally integrated the one lesson the entire structure of their life had been built to avoid. Their worth was never actually up for negotiation. It didn't need to be earned through one more deadline, one more title, one more flawless performance. It had been there the entire time, waiting for them to stop outrunning it. This isn't the end of ambition. It's the beginning of choosing, deliberately, what's actually worth building, and that is exactly what the world could use more of. Not people burning themselves down to look impressive to others who were never really watching. People who have learned to build, powerfully and on their own terms, from a foundation that doesn't collapse the moment the applause stops. Welcome to enough. You've earned this, not through one more achievement, but by finally believing it was already true.